What's up, everybody? Welcome to the 4040 Vision podcast. I'm your host, Khaled Abdallah, and I'm joined today by a special guest, Sabreena Merchant of The Athletic. Sabreena is a women's basketball staff writer for The Athletic, and she's previously covered the WNBA and NBA for SB Nation. Sabreena, how's everything going today?
It's going well. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for agreeing to come on. So today's topic is about the current and future state of women's basketball, the WNBA, the growth of the women's game here in the U.S. But before we jump into all that, I wanted to get to know you a little bit and understand your journey and how you got to The Athletic. So what's your background? When did you become interested in basketball? Did you play growing up? And when did you decide that you wanted to become a sports writer for a living?
Yeah, basketball has been a part of my family basically since I was born. My parents moved to LA right around the time of the Showtime Lakers. And that was kind of my dad's first introduction to America, becoming a Laker fan. And that's how he essentially assimilated to, being an American living in LA. And when my brother and I were born, he gave us these Laker footy pajamas and we always watched games at home and, had subscription to the LA Times and would read that every morning if we didn't get to watch the game last night, even if we did get to watch the game the night before. So the Lakers was pretty much the lifeblood of our family for a very long time. I played a little basketball growing up. Like a lot of immigrant families, my parents were more interested in academic side of things than athletic side of things, so sports weren't exactly prioritized. I definitely kept watching sports throughout my life, but playing the game wasn't really a big part of it, for most of it. But then when I got to high school, I decided to write for the school paper my senior year, did a little football. And then when I got to college, it really just jump-started because I attended Duke and writing about sports, obviously much bigger deal at an institution like that. Writing about basketball, very big deal at an institution like that. Even while I was in school, though, I wasn't sure that this was something that I wanted to do like forever. I was still sort of in that mode of the thing that you do for a job shouldn't be your primary passion, because then what do you do when you're trying to get off of work? And then I sort of realized that, I spend so much time in my work that I might as well just do something that I really love, even if it's not something that I considered like a traditional career growing up, right? Like I went to school, I was pre-med. Like the plan was to go to medical school and, have a respected job like that. And nobody I knew was a sports writer or even a journalist. And it just took a little mental reframing in my early and mid 20s to figure out that this was something that I wanted to do, something that was acceptable to do. But once I realized that it was, making me happy and was a good job, I just went full steam ahead. I did a lot of freelancing. I even wrote for free for a little while first, and just kept pushing and pushing until SB Nation gave me my full-time job, and now I'm at The Athletic. So
That's awesome. That's quite the journey. I mean, you mentioned the immigrant parents. I think that's a very normal thing for a lot of us to go through, with them wanting us to have, you use the word, the respectable job, and, going into a field that they're comfortable with or they're familiar with.
Exactly.
And the other thing that you mentioned about, no one that is a sports writer or was a sports writer at the time. I don't think a lot of people, from our backgrounds were in sports at the time, or at least, for sports journalism at the time. And I mean, obviously people like you and then lots of other folks have changed that and have made it a much more realistic thing. So, I mean, what part of the job do you most enjoy? What's most rewarding for you in your kind of your day to day?
I would say the first thing is that so much of my life consists of watching basketball, which is legitimately one of my favorite things to do. So just to be able to spend all of my time at these games or, watching on television or talking basketball with people, I can't just describe what kind of a blessing it is that the thing that I was doing for most of my free time anyway, like I can't tell you the number of group texts I have that are just devoted to one of them's Duke basketball, one of them's Laker basketball, one of them's NBA basketball, another one's women's basketball, right? Like all of that just gets to happen in my working life now too, which is just awesome. And then I also think that my job presents this intellectual challenge on a regular basis because writing really taxes my brain. Like I have to think about it a lot. Like I enjoy the process of writing and putting together a story and sharing something that I find interesting with people who are going to read it, but it's work, right? Like it's hard for me to do. And putting together the pieces is constantly a challenge, but I like that my mind is constantly working and that I get to do something a little bit different every day because every story requires a slightly different process, to put together. So just like the variety of what I get to do and the fact that it's always interesting and like stimulating for me is really rewarding.
Yeah, I've done a little bit of moonlighting as a sports writer in the past. It's a lot of staff writing stuff for fan-sided sites and things like that. So I know that once it becomes like your day to day, it can be challenging to do that. The writer's block is real. It's definitely easier to get in front of a microphone and talk versus putting the words down on paper. So you've been in the sports world and the basketball world for a few years now. What's been the highlight of this? I mean, and probably a tough question to answer. I'm sure there's a few, but what are, a couple moments that have stood out to you? Maybe a time where you were starstruck by meeting someone. I know you're not a fan, but, or just a moment that you were really grateful to be able to experience in person and as a professional.
Well, I think first and foremost, I kind of want to dispute that. I'm absolutely a fan. Like I may have this as a job, but I grew up a Laker fan. I grew up watching the LA Sparks in Los Angeles too. Like those are two associations that I've never given up, no matter how long I've been in this. Obviously, I'm a younger writer compared to some of the more veteran people, but like there are athletes who I grew up adoring. There are teams that I grew up adoring, and like those things don't just go away, right? Like everybody who I talk to in the WNBA knows that I'm always caping for the Sparks, even if I'm writing about other teams, if I'm covering other teams. That doesn't mean that I'm not critical of them. Obviously, I feel like I'm just as, honest about the challenges that they face going forward, and I'm sure we'll get into WNBA stuff later. But I just think it's important to be honest with like my readers and the people who follow my work that like, yeah, I'm totally a fan of such and such players and such teams. And I think I can still be good at my job even while doing that. But I also think it makes me better because I genuinely care about the product that I'm watching, the product that I'm covering. Right. But that means that I've definitely been in some starstruck moments. I think the first time that I met Jerry West while covering the Clippers was definitely a, whew, can't believe this is happening kind of moment. I could not talk. Like, I was carrying a plate, like an empty plate of food, thank God, dropped it. He offered to pick it up. I said, no, I can do this. And then that was the first time I met Jerry West. And then just like the act of, getting to walk around an arena as if like I work there as opposed to, having to like sit in my seat and, like act as a fan the whole time. That was such an interesting, dynamic shift because like I've been to so many games as a fan before, and like this was a sacred setting, right? Like where I was only allowed to occupy certain spaces, and now I exist there differently, right? I get to walk around and just chat with people, and players know my name, and it's still like a very pinch me thing sometimes that like the people that I grew up spending so much time obsessing over, like those same type of people are like, hey, Sabreena, like what's up?
Yeah, I've had the opportunity to do that a few times through the soccer writing I did for Fansided, and it's a surreal experience at first because you're wondering like, what am I doing here? Am I supposed to be here? Am I allowed here? And then you flash the badge, and it's very cool. It's a completely different experience versus coming in as a fan. And the other thing you mentioned about the fact that you are still a fan, I think is it's like a new concept in sports writing. I feel like growing up, all the sports writers were all kind of like older dudes who were kind of grumpy, and they never talked about the team in a positive light, and they could never show any sort of bias. And I think the bias, or whatever you want to call it, I think it adds some flavor to the coverage, as long as you understand that where people are coming from and who they kind of root for in the background. But I mean, do you think it's a positive? You think it brings a different kind of spin to the work that you do?
I mean, I think everyone who's in this business is, interested in basketball, interested in sports, at some point or another. And like that enthusiasm, that joy, I would hope carries into the work, whether they're fans of individual teams, whether they're fans of the league as a whole. Like, I don't think it particularly matters. I just think it's important to be honest about the fact that like we all bring some sort of perspective. We all bring some sort of bias into it. Just being able to put that to the side while you're working on something is just the most important part.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you started off your career covering the NBA for SB Nation, right? So, and now you're covering, the women's basketball, WNBA. I think this is kind of a segue into some of the challenges that WNBA faces as well. But what do you think, are some of the biggest differences and some of the, things that you've experienced in covering the two leagues?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing to think about. I kind of started covering both leagues at the same time, and At that point, this is like pre-pandemic, the access to both was fairly similar, right? Like you had open locker rooms, you had the opportunity to talk to players and coaches pre-game, shoot around, post-game, like all of the access points are very similar. There obviously is a distinction between some players who are significantly more famous and have more money, who don't think that they need to participate in the media activities as much as others. So I did notice, at certain levels that I thought the WNBA players were a lot more giving with their time than NBA players. And that wasn't like, a blanket statement. There were obviously some NBA players who were perfectly wonderful and gave really thoughtful answers. It just like at the star level, there was some differences between the very best NBA players realizing that they have a platform where they can reach audiences without having to go through the media, whereas the very best WNBA player is like the media is still a very useful outlet for them. So that was something that sort of struck me right away. I do think that balance has, I wouldn't say it's shifted. Like there are definitely some more popular women's basketball players now that don't need the media in the same way. But I still think as a whole, just like the women that I speak to are a little bit more understanding of the role that media plays in the growth of their overall league, because the WNBA is growing at a significantly different rate than the NBA is, right? Like the NBA, I wouldn't say that it's plateaued. It's obviously still reaching massive viewership numbers but it's in a different phase of its existence than the W, whereas, the WNBA, the players realize that they still need to take part in, moving it forward. So I think that's part of it. But then, after the pandemic and in this past year, the WNBA shut its locker rooms. And that's really changed the type of interactions that I can have with players, because
I did hear about this. Yeah.
Yeah. I think this is one thing that people don't necessarily understand if you're not in the media space, where a lot of the conversations that I have with players and executives and coaches, they're not just for a story. They're me trying to get to know them so that when I do need something for a story, it's easier to have a conversation with them. Because I think anybody can understand this. The first time you talk to someone is not going to be the most productive conversation, right? Like there's a getting to know you phase. And the locker room was so helpful in terms of just getting an opportunity to say hi to people, talk to them about things that are not necessarily basketball related or game related, and just, establish a level of familiarity, a level of comfort. And I really do miss that, because now every time I have to talk to a player, it has to be transactional, because I'm taking a moment of their time away, that they could be leaving, to go early. Like I'm holding them at the end of practice. I'm holding them after a game. And I just think that changes the relationship that you build with them. And I have missed that a little bit. And I've noticed that because I can still talk to executives and I can still talk to coaches, in just sideline spaces. And I feel like those relationships have worked out really well for me. Whereas I don't know that I've gotten to connect with as many players as maybe would have been possible had the locker room still been open.
What was the driver behind it? Is it just COVID? Was it something else that
So what's
drove
interesting
this
is that
decision?
the locker room was open in 2022, but then in 2023, the WNBA made a decision to close it. And the rationale, as specified by the Players Association in the league, was that so many players were being forced to stay late that weren't actually being talked to, and they just wanted an opportunity to leave earlier. And then there was also some discussion about the locker room being a private place, and that, they would prefer not to have media in there. And I'm receptive to the idea that maybe you don't want people in a locker room. I still do think having the players in a, mixed zone area for people who cover soccer, or just a separate room that's not your locker room, but still gives you the opportunity to just walk one by one to player and maybe talk to 4 of them at once, because group conversations are awesome too, because people just chime in to one another and you get different answers than you would expect. I would hope that they had given, some alternative to the locker room space if that was the issue. And then as far as wanting to leave early, I mean, the way the system works now, after games, theoretically you have to stay even longer if a player is being requested. So I don't think that really solves the problem.
Yeah, I guess it makes it just a much more formal process. That I can see why that's frustrating as a journalist. I mean, what are some of the challenges? You talked about the WNBA being in a different stage than the NBA in its growth. I mean, I think obviously the NBA has a significant head start on the WNBA in terms of popularity and all that. What are some of the challenges? Is it access? Is it, things like this that you think are holding the league back? What do you think are some of the obstacles that they're facing in their growth?
Yeah, so just, bare bones, the WNBA is about 50 years younger than the NBA. And in terms of where the NBA was at this point in its growth, like viewership numbers are fairly similar. Attendance is even more than what the NBA had. Obviously, population sizes are bigger, like that factors into it. So it's not a apples to apples comparison. But considering where the NBA was, like the WNBA is not altogether in a different space than a 27-year-old NBA. But with all of the potential, access points that the WNBA could have right now, I just don't think it's taking advantage of all of them. Like for one, the media rights deal that the WNBA currently has, I think significantly undervalues the league. It doesn't put it on, television in the most advantageous situations. Like, you have playoffs competing against the NFL Sundays, which is never going to work out very well for anybody, let alone the WNBA. Like the NBA shies away from competing against the NFL, right? So that's part of it. I think just getting in better TV windows would help. I also think that, the WNBA was kind of scared off by the recession in like the late 2000s when a lot of the league teams had to shut down, and it stayed at this size of 12 for about, I think, 15 years right now. And you look at similarly, so I compare it a lot to the MLS because the MLS started in the same year as the WNBA, and the MLS is about to hit 32 teams, I think. And the WNBA is still at 12. And the MLS has decided that the way for it to make money is through expansion fees. And the WNBA is completely cutting off that source of income by refusing to expand to more teams. And you have this problem where the college game is getting more and more popular, has always been more popular than the WNBA because you have these built-in fan bases. It's a product that exists all across the country, not just in 12 markets. And then you follow your favorite college players, and most of them cannot make the league because there's just not enough space. So you're losing an opportunity to expand to more markets. You're not capturing the college fan base, and then you're not getting these expansion fees. So I think those are all of these things that the league wants to have, like a sustainable business model in its first 12 teams before expanding. But I think a lot of the problems that it faces could be resolved by adding more teams. I think about the NWSL even, like it's 10 years old. It already has 12 teams. It's supposed to expand to 16 within 3 years. Mm-hmm. And yes, women's soccer has a different, imagination in the US than women's basketball does. But I do think that there are lessons to be had, from just having a larger footprint across the United States. And WNBA just kind of feels stuck the longer it stays at 12. And then I guess just one last thing is, like, the WNBA is a very socially progressive league. We had this situation in 2020 during the WNBA bubble season where the Atlanta Dream backed a senatorial candidate from Georgia who was running against the owner of their team, right? And so they backed, Reverend Warnock ahead of their owner, Kelly Loeffler. And it's just the kind of thing where the WNBA takes social issues very seriously. They dedicated that season to the justice for Breonna Taylor. But I wonder if sometimes the WNBA, its messaging focuses so much on what it does other than basketball that we're ignoring the fact that, hey, this is just a really cool basketball product. That's how we're supposed to be marketing it, as a basketball product. And maybe we focus too much on the other things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I think on the...
Yeah, sorry, I went a little long.
No, it's great. I mean, I think on the issue of expansion, I think that's a great point. The growth is the way to grow. It sounds pretty simple, right? I understand that you do want to be sustainable and things like that, but there's so many huge media markets that just don't have a team, that are probably, crying out for a team. There's the Bay Area doesn't have one, Philadelphia, Miami, right? There's some other ones I'm sure I'm missing, I'm leaving off, but just like you said with MLS, they found out that, people will pay a ton of money to own a professional sports team. And same with the NWSL. They're having incredible success in LA with Angel City. I know the Sparks are already in LA, but I think that success can be replicated in some of these other markets. Has there been any talk about expansion to some of these, some of the biggest metro areas in the US?
Well, that's the thing. Expansion is always a talking point. And it's almost doing a disservice because the more we talk about expansion without it happening, it's like the boy who cried wolf when the commissioner says, we've whittled down a list of 100 cities to 20 and then to 10. And now we're visiting 20 cities again. There just hasn't been consistent messaging about what the league wants to do with regards to expansion. And at this point, fans are just getting a little let me know when it actually happens,
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the other thing you mentioned about there just not being enough teams. I mean, I've been reading about first round picks getting cut in their second year just because there isn't enough roster spots. I mean, is that a potential solution? Maybe expanding a roster spot, having some kind of developmental league, the a G League type for the WNBA as opposed to having, full on professional franchises. Is that something that's been discussed?
Yeah, a lot of coaches and players that I've talked to have talked about the idea of like a taxi squad, maybe three players who aren't necessarily paid a full salary, but who get to practice with the team, who get to work out with the team, who, have been to training camp, know the system. So when like a player goes out, you can bring them up and then it's like a nice developmental pathway so that, you know, if like let's say you're a first round pick who gets cut in training camp, you don't play your rookie year right out of college, it's really hard to find your way back into the league, like because you're already behind all the players who are on the rosters, and then the next draft class comes in, and how do you distinguish yourself from them because they're on cheaper rookie contracts and like more team control and yada yada yada. So it's just so hard to be a developmental player in this league unless you're in the perfect situation, right? Like New York is carrying one rookie. Las Vegas is carrying one rookie, right? A lot of these, like, and who knows if these players will even be able to make the roster the next year when salaries come a little higher for their existing veterans, and now we have to, shuffle some things around. So it's just really hard to be a young player in this league if you're not immediately contributing, because then you're just seen as like this dispensable roster spot. And I do think that I don't know if the WNBA has the infrastructure for like a full-on G League. There was some talks about maybe like having a coexisting like 3x3 league where, each franchise sort of operates its own 3-on-3 team, and then like people are still playing and they're still around the franchise, and then maybe you can tap into that system if you need players when, you have injuries and whatnot. But the idea of expanding roster sizes is definitely something that has gained a lot of momentum. Over at The Athletic, we did a anonymous player poll of, players around the league, got about a third of the league. And we asked the question of, would you rather have expanded roster sizes or more teams? And the majority said expanded roster sizes, because we're in the situation where like you're only allowed to carry 12 players max. A lot of teams only carry 11 because they don't have the salary cap flexibility to carry 12. So if you lose 2 players to injury, all of a sudden you can't even run 5-on-5 in practice. And like that is just not a good way of running practices when you are a WNBA team. Oh. So yeah, I think any way to get more people in the building for the WNBA is a good thing, whether that's more teams, whether that's bigger roster sizes. I personally think both need to happen, but it's all being discussed. It's just a very slow pathway to change.
Yeah, absolutely. I think both of those are great paths, either the expansion of the league or the roster sizes. I didn't know that they only carry 12 because of those salary cap restrictions. I know the salary cap has become a point of contention as well. I mean, if I remember correctly, Mark Davis, the owner of the Aces, was in some hot water for trying to circumvent the salary cap. And, there's the issue of the chartered flights and things like that. I mean, do you see these as obstacles as well, or are they just, potential opportunities to improve the league?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that the WNBA does with the theory of retaining competitive balance across the league. So if certain owners are unable to pay for charter flights for their teams for all games, we're going to institute a prohibition on charter flights for all teams. What Mark Davis does is actually what he was alleged to have done, and what the Aces were eventually required to forfeit a first round pick for, was something that every team is not allowed to do. Like if you sign a contract with a team, they're not allowed to pay you more beyond the contract, right? Like that's just something that exists at any level of any professional sports. I'm sure because of the compensation that WNBA players are making, that there are deals all around the league, for like, if you sign here, we'll make sure you get an endorsement by such and such, and like technically that's illegal. I personally don't care. I just want the players to get paid. Like they perform incredibly well at their jobs. They deserve to get more money. One of the things that, gets discussed, like the WNBA pay gap gets discussed a lot, like relative to the NBA. And like, I'm not super interested in that number. It's just the revenue that the WNBA makes. The players don't get an equal share of that as they do in the NBA. And so I understand players wanting to get more money, even if it's like in fuzzy ways. I don't particularly care one way about that or the other. But yeah, the WNBA says that it's instituting all these measures for competitive balance, but there are all these other ways that competitive balance doesn't exist in the league, right? Like there are better coaches, there are better players, there are better practice facilities, there are larger performance staffs. So to, hold the line at these one or two specific things seems very silly to me. And I think if you want to move the league forward, then you have to let certain teams bring it forward and then see who will come along with them. And either they will or they'll fall behind. They have to sell.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like in the NBA, right? I mean, obviously there is that competitive balance, a salary cap, whatever, but, there's owners that are willing to exceed and deal with the luxury tax. There's owners that'll spend, a couple $100 million on a state-of-the-art practice facility, and some that want their guys to practice in like a high school gym or something. So, that's a great point. And the point that you made about, the revenue share, I don't think anyone reasonable is saying that the NBA or WNBA players should match the NBA salary, but I think it's very reasonable to say that they should get the same percentage of the revenue. I think that seems like a no-brainer type thing. I get why the owners wouldn't want that, but it seems like the natural progression in this conversation. And the last thing you mentioned about, the messaging of the WNBA and the social issues and the things like that. I'm curious about that. I mean, I feel like their messaging used to be, hey, women play basketball too. I feel like it's morphing a little bit into, hey, these are great athletes doing, cool things that athletes do. I mean, what do you think? Do you think that's on a purposeful move to move the focus away from, hey, come watch women play basketball versus come watch, the best in the world do what they do?
I guess I'm not sure I understand the difference in what you're asking there.
Like, do you think it was a decisive, like something they decided, like, let's try to shift away from the fact that highlighting that these are women athletes versus that this is just the best in the world doing what they do?
Yeah, I think the comparison to the NBA, I don't know that it's ever served the WNBA that well, because on the one hand, like, it was helpful at the start of the league to have franchises that were also owned by NBA franchises. So you had this built-in infrastructure, like of facilities, arenas, all of that, like
names,
the understanding of how to run a basketball league. But comparing women's basketball players to men's basketball players just doesn't work. One, they don't play the same length of the game. And two, their bodies are different. The way they play the game is different. And I don't think that, saying like, oh, like Alyssa Thomas put up this stat line that has only happened once in WNBA history and it's happened 100 times in NBA history, like that doesn't do a service to either side, because, it just, one, it makes it seem like men are stat padding, but like it also it looks like it's an inferior product then, which I don't think that's the way you want to sell it. So I think just the proximity to the NBA has been difficult for the WNBA to overcome, because on the one hand, yes, it is like it owns half of the WNBA and the financial benefits are obviously important, but this is just an entirely different product, right? Like in college basketball, we don't have commercials of Paige Beckers alongside, like, I can't think of a single Connecticut men's player's name, like Jordan Hawkins or something,
Sure.
Or like, I literally can't think of men's college basketball players, so I'm just not going to do this little exercise anymore. But,
I get what you're saying. I get it.
We don't prop them up next to each other. Like Connecticut women's basketball is its own thing and it's promoted as such. And I think that's, where the WNBA should fall.
Yeah, I think we saw some of that messaging leading up to the Women's World Cup. I think the French national team, they did some kind of digital photoshopping of putting, the face of some men's players on the women's bodies and said, oh, look, they're doing the same thing. And I understood the intent behind it. I don't think the message landed quite as well as they hoped it would. But yeah, I totally agree. It's a completely different thing, and it should be appreciated for what it is. That it's it's not a different sport, but it's a different group of people playing this game at an incredibly high level, and that should be enough to appreciate it. So in terms of the growth of the WNBA, what are some of the major changes that you've seen in the coverage, the exposure, maybe some things on social media or media rights? What are some of the biggest changes or biggest drivers of the growth of the league?
Yeah, I think getting on television is one thing. WNBA has a league pass product like NBA does, and all of the games are generally available there if they're not on national television. but you're seeing more and more games available on national platforms, like whether that's games streamed via Twitter or this deal with Amazon Prime or CBS Sports or Ion. All of these are different platforms that didn't exist from when I first started covering the league. So that's, just when things are on television, people will watch them. Like, that's just how the world works. So getting things on national television always helps. There are more games on ABC. There are more games on ESPN versus ESPN2, like those things matter. ESPN2 is a more premium channel than ESPN. Like, not everybody else gets it. So I think more visibility, obviously a big thing that's happened for the league. I think the talent level has just gone up even more and more, like since I started covering the league, Asia Wilson entered the league, and obviously one of the greatest players we've ever seen. We're about to get this huge influx of college stars. Aaliyah Boston just came in. We're going to get Caitlin Clark and Paige Beckers, and, just this enormous line of college stars who's about to come in with their huge NIL followings and bring a new fan base into the league. I also think that, the quality of the player experience has also gone up a lot of places. Like, the San Antonio Stars moved to Las Vegas, sold to MGM and then sold to Mark Davis, who has built his own practice facility, hired Becky Hammon for $1 million, more than any coach had ever been paid in WNBA history. We're seeing, a new ownership in Phoenix pour a lot of money into the Mercury. Obviously, the Size bought the Brooklyn Nets owners, the Joe Size, bought the New York Liberty, took them out of Westchester County Center, like this high school facility that they were playing, and put them into Barclays Center. And now, that's a real world-class professional organization. A couple other teams are also building their own practice facilities. It's an arms race, right? Like, you see one team doing something and everybody wants to match that. Like, how else are you going to compete in free agency, And free agency too, the fact that the WNBA amended its contract rules so that there's actually player movement during the offseason means we start talking about the league about 2 months earlier than we ever did before. So there's a lot of positive drivers, still a lot of work to do, obviously, but I do think it's a significantly better product than when I first started covering it 6 years ago.
Yeah, and one of the other things is, you mentioned covering the social justice and pushing those issues. So as a result, I'm sure there's some controversial, challenging situations or topics that you have to cover, things related to gender equality, diversity, things like that. What's your approach to that? Do you aim to stay objective as a reporter? What approach do you take to covering those sort of topics? Maybe like the Brittany Griner one, for example, or, some other ones, I'm sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the thing with sports is no matter what league you're covering, these are just people, right? And people experience issues the same way you and I do. Just because they're professional athletes who happen to have very high profile jobs doesn't mean they don't still deal with pregnancy discrimination or, all sorts of issues that face normal people in the workplace. And that's just the way I try to approach it, right? I know these people that I'm writing about, there's obviously a layer of sensitivity attached to it, but you just report it the same way you would report anything else. Make sure you have the facts behind it and present the story in the most objective way possible.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And you mentioned this becoming an arms race in the WNBA with teams competing with practice facilities and all kinds of things like that. And I think, we don't want to compare it to the NBA. It's kind of a lazy thing to do, but one of the things that helped the NBA and its popularity was the dynasties in the 80s and the competitive fire that we saw in the storylines and the narratives. So, is that something cooking up? You mentioned Las Vegas and New York as some of the teams that were doing kind of the most when it came to the competitive balance and the arms race. Do you see them as the dynasties and the competitive dynasties that we're going to see that the WNBA build on? And is the WNBA taking that opportunity to use these narratives to grow the league?
Yeah, I think the WNBA has almost done too much to promote the Las Vegas-New York rivalry this year. From the very moment that Breanna Stewart signed her contract this offseason, it's been, super team in Las Vegas, super team in New York. And, it's great to have a storyline to build your season around. I think, especially when you have the two best players in the league on those opposite teams, the winners of three of the last 5 MVP trophies, 3 of the last WNBA champions. 3 of the last 5 MVP trophies, 3 of the last 5 WNBA champions. If you took the 15 best players in the league, I would say that 8 come from those two starting lineups. There's a huge consolidation of talents. It's very marketable. There's an easy draw. It's West Coast, East Coast, I do think just having that storyline to frame things is helpful. It's easy for fans to latch onto. And the games have frankly been pretty interesting this year. And they're both at the top of the standings, projected to meet in the finals if everything shakes out the way it's supposed to. So yeah, I think the WNBA is absolutely leaning into this. It's a smart idea. Rivalries have always worked well, for professional leagues. Even with the WNBA, like in the late 2010s, there was a Minnesota Lynx Los Angeles Sparks rivalry that did really well in terms of pushing numbers. Like that was one of the highest viewed finals, I think, in the league's history. So it makes a lot of sense to continue promoting the league this way. I'm sure the other 10 teams wish they had more of a say in it. But again, it's all about, pushing everyone forward, right? Like these teams found a way to like consolidate all these stars. Now we're seeing every other team that has a big all-star, they all just signed huge extensions during the, the end of the regular season. So like the competition does not stop, right? Like just because these two teams happen to be ahead for now, like everybody is chasing down their bags for 2024.
Yeah, it's definitely an easy way to bring in the casual fan is to pit these two teams, say the super team narratives, things like that. I'm sure some of the basketball purists might shake their head a little bit and say, what about the other 10 teams? There's, X great player on this team and things like that. But, it is much easier to sell, put on a billboard or put in a, a 30-second promo on ESPN versus, some of the more detailed basketball coverage. So, I mean, I think
at least there's two, and it's not like just one team running away with everything.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, at Las Vegas, they won the championship last year, right? So I'm sure there's some narratives about them defending and the Liberty trying to knock them off and all that. So it's fun for sure as a casual fan. And I've been seeing the growth of women's college basketball kind of mirror the growth of the WNBA. You mentioned a couple times with some of these big stars that are coming in with their big NIL following. And I mean, do you one of the things that actually came up during the tournament was that some of these players are choosing to stay behind, stay in school longer because of these big NIL deals compared to a WNBA contract, or maybe they're worried about the WNBA rosters. Do you think that could be a driver of change when maybe they lose out on a star deciding to stay, an extra season in college versus coming out to the WNBA?
I would sincerely hope that that's a driver of change. As far as the NIL deals, like you'll get sponsorships whether you're in college or not. Like if you're a good player, Mercedes-Benz is going to want to sponsor you whether you live in Baton Rouge or whether you are playing for the Chicago Sky. So I don't think that's too much of an issue. I think it's just more so player experience, right? Like college, the best teams charter flights. They do not do that in the WNBA, right? You also just get to like be the big woman on campus. Like that's pretty cool, winning national titles and like getting to walk around without a care in the world. Like leaving college and going to be an adult, I can understand why people would want to stay a little bit longer. And this is not going to be a thing that exists forever. Like this is the last class that has the eligibility to use a COVID year. So it's not going to be something that, pops up, too far down the line. But I do think that like a big challenge for the WNBA is just making sure that they capitalize on all this college momentum. Like we had a college national championship game that, peaked, I think at like 12 million viewers or something, at least 10 million. And then we had the WNBA draft not 10 days later that was less than 1 million. And the draft should be including all of the best college players. And yet we couldn't capture, even 10% of that audience.
Do you think that might drive some of the changes in the eligibility? Because I believe now it's 3 years of college or 3 years post high school. I'm not saying they'll go, straight out of high school, but could it be a one and done type situation eventually?
I don't think that's ever going to change in the WNBA. I mean, it's not even 3. You have to be graduated from college or at least 22 years old by the time you enter the WNBA draft. And because the league has so few spots, I can't imagine them opening up, to more players and forcing out more veterans. That just doesn't seem like it's going to be good for business either way. And I think getting college products who are ready to contribute, who have gone through 4 years of even more maturity and seasoning, like I think that's better for the WNBA game as a whole, because there's no roster spots available for you to have players to develop, right? Like if you're 19 and don't know how to play yet, what good are you on a 12-player roster? So I don't think that's a rule that's going to change. I think it's more just the WNBA figuring out how to, convert that audience into a pro audience as well.
Got it. Yeah, maybe one day in the distant future when there's 20 or 24 or 30 WNBA teams, who knows? But yeah, I can see why they would keep that rule as is. And I honestly didn't know it was 4 years. I thought it was 3. So that's good to know. So before we let you go, I mean, any predictions for the upcoming season? You did or the upcoming playoffs. I know we're coming up on that in the next 2 weeks, right? You mentioned the Liberty and the Aces are top of the standings. They're projected to meet in the finals. Do you smell any upsets brewing? How do you see things playing out?
At the risk of being supremely boring, I do not predict any upsets. I have said this elsewhere. I think the first round is going to be entirely sweeps, actually. And I do think that we're going to get that long-awaited New York-Las Vegas matchup in the WNBA Finals. As far as what happens, I took the liberty as my preseason pick. I recently suggested that Las Vegas having home court advantage gives them the slightest of advantages. I really don't know what to do here. I think I'm just going to stick with my preseason pick, New York, because Brianna Stewart, what she does is win titles, and she hasn't won one in like 3 years. So it's about time, Stewie.
Yeah, it's good to stick with your pick. You don't want to switch up last minute. I'm a Raiders fan, so I am, an Aces fan kind of by default. We don't have a local team out here in the Bay Area, so just pick the next best thing. And it's nice to cheer for the best team in the league. So where can folks find your work? Where can they follow you on social media, aside, of course, from The Athletic?
Yeah, I mean, really all of my work shows up at The Athletic. We also have, in addition to the written content at theathletic.com, we also have The Athletic Women's Basketball Show, a podcast that's coming out 2 times a week, talking about all things women's basketball. Right now, it's more WNBA related just because we're in the playoffs. They do start on Wednesday. So, yeah, just check me out there.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you coming on. And hopefully we'll catch up sometime soon. Maybe after the playoffs, we could do a season in review or something like that. But once again, appreciate your time.
Thanks.